Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of American Criminal. In this season, slavery, people trafficking, fraud, and murder are just some of the things Sante Kimes did to get what she wanted. Listen to American Criminal Sante Kimes wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get ad-free access to the entire season first, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.
It's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, on the 61st floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Thane Thompson, a young, newly employed trainee from Morgan Stanley, takes a quick coffee break. He stands by a window, looking out over the Statue of Liberty. It's a beautiful morning. The sky is spotless and royal blue. As he takes a sip of his coffee, he hears a strange, muffled thud. A coworker pokes her head up from her desk. "Was that thunder?" "I don't know, I heard it too." Thane leans his head toward the window and looks around. Outside, everything seems normal. His colleague looks puzzled. "What do you think that was?" "Well, I'm not sure, but it's not thunder. It sounded like an explosion, something." Thane stops mid-sentence. Out the window, he sees office paper raining down from above. Some of the pages are on fire. He looks at his colleague, startled. Suddenly, fire alarms start going off in the office. Thane turns to his colleague. "Grab your things, we need to go." "What the hell's going on?" "I have no idea, but we have to go right now." As the fire alarm blares overhead, the office stirs with nervous commotion. Everyone files out through the stairwell, where they're met by a line of people making their way down from the upper floors. As Thane slides into the line, he queries a man in front of him. "Hey, have you heard anything about what's going on?" "I don't know, it was a prop plane or something. Apparently it flew right into the side of the North Tower." Thane is stunned. The man shakes his head in frustration. "Goddamn idiot. Just hope everyone's okay." "Yeah." But just then, the fire alarms stop. Overhead, the PA system blares out a message.
"The incident in the North Tower has been contained. It is safe to return to work. I repeat, the incident in the North Tower has been contained. It is safe to return to work."
As the message continues on loop, a few people in the stairwell turn around and head back. But Thane and the man in front of him exchange suspicious glances. "I think we should keep going, at least until we know it's safe." "I agree. I'm sticking with you." And just then, a large boom rattles the stairwell, shaking the walls and flickering lights. "God, what was that?" "I don't know. Let's just get down to the ground floor. Everyone, come on. Quickly as you can. Come on, move." By the time they reach the ground floor, the group of employees is sweaty and disheveled. As they step outside, it's a war zone on the ground. The streets are covered in dust, full of police cars and fire engines. As hundreds of people run in every direction, large squads of firemen rush into the building. Out of the commotion, a police officer approaches the group of workers.
"This way, people, let's go."
In a panic, Thane grabs the cop by the arm. "What's happening, sir? Did a prop plane really do all this?" "It was not a prop plane, son. We need to get the hell out of here. Go, get out of here. We're under attack." From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, attacks on the North and South Towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, as well as the hijacking of United Flight 93, resulted in the death of 2,997 American men and women, including firefighters, policemen, first responders, and everyday citizens. Across the nation, Americans were in a state of shock and disbelief. When President Bush received word of the attack, he was reading to a classroom full of kindergartners at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. When his chief of staff whispered the news in his ear, Bush waited 7 minutes to react. Many in the press criticized his moment of indecision. But by day's end, amidst the suffering and confusion, the president would seize what many would call his defining moment.
Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve. for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
After the president's address to the nation, members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, assembled on the steps of Capitol Hill to sing God Bless America. Volunteers rushed to Ground Zero to help search and rescue teams clear out the wreckage. The president went too, just days after the attacks, comforting firefighters, police officers, and rescue workers as they searched for survivors in the smoldering rubble and debris. At once, the nation demanded justice. Just a few days after the Twin Towers came down, Al-Qaeda, a Salafist terrorist organization based in Afghanistan, claimed responsibility. Their leader, Osama bin Laden, quickly became public enemy number one. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the U.S., alongside soldiers from the U.K., invaded Afghanistan. With bipartisan support, President Bush aimed to topple the Taliban, a fundamentalist political organization that ruled over a great deal of Afghanistan and provided sanctuary for al-Qaeda. Although the Taliban did not share al-Qaeda's global jihadist ambition, the two groups found common ground in their adherence to a fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam. As such, the Taliban's leader, Mullah Omar, would not give bin Laden to the United States. But the moment of national unity in the wake of 9/11 would be momentary. Over the course of the next year, the president's foreign policy would expand in scope when developments in the Middle East gave rise to a familiar enemy, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. The conflict between the U.S. and Iraq would test the resolve of the American people, fracture public opinion, and dominate and define the high-stakes wartime election of 2004. This is episode 55, the election of 2004, Bush versus Kerry, do or die. Saddam Hussein had been on America's radar even before the Persian Gulf War back in 1991. The Gulf War ended in February of that year. According to reporting by the BBC, the end of the war left Iraq subject to United Nations sanctions and arms inspections to look for weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear. But disputes over inspectors' access to Iraqi facilities continued for years, with punitive U.S.-led air raids taking place in December of 1998 under President Clinton. In January of 2002, President Bush named Iraq part of what he called the Axis of Evil, along with Iran and North Korea. In September of that same year, President Bush addressed the United Nations and warned Iraq that military action would be unavoidable if it did not comply with the UN's calls for weapons inspections and disarmament. When Hussein refused to fully comply, Bush called for an invasion of Iraq, claiming that Hussein was in possession of nuclear weapons, also known as weapons of mass destruction, or WMD. Bush also claimed that Hussein had ties to the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden. Congress did not universally agree. Many Democrats opposed military intervention and urged the president to let the United Nations handle Hussein. Many Republicans argued that Hussein posed a legitimate threat to national security. After much debate, on October 10, 2002, the House moved to give President Bush the authority to act. In the House, 215 Republicans and 81 Democrats voted in favor of the Iraq resolution, as it was informally known. The next day in the Senate, 48 Democrats and 29 Republicans voted yay. 21 Democrats, 1 Republican, and 1 independent voted nay. Subsequently, Bush gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum: comply with the UN or face the full force of the U.S. military. The next 4 months saw the American public split by the prospect of war, with some favoring diplomacy and others supporting military intervention. Then on February 5, 2003, Secretary of Defense Colin Powell testified in front of the United Nations Security Council that the U.S. had indeed discovered weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Equipped with the evidence needed for the nation's support, Bush was poised to take action. On March 18th, Bush issued his final offer to Saddam Hussein: leave Iraq within 48 hours or prepare for war. It's March 19, 2003, in the Situation Room in the basement of the West Wing of the White House. The room is full of communications equipment, including a large television monitor on the far wall. President Bush has ordered an emergency conference call with the lead commanders of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force. As the commanders connect one by one, their faces appear on screen, stoic and serious. At the center of the screen is the commander of the United States Central Command, 4-star General Tommy Franks. The room is tense and dead quiet as the men wait for their commander-in-chief. President Bush enters the room with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld by his side. After taking a seat, the president breaks the silence. Gentlemen, I don't think I need to remind you of the gravity of the moment. I don't want to waste any more time, so I'll get right into it. Bush directs his attention towards General Franks at the center of the screen. General Franks, can you hear me? Franks turns on his audio.
Yes, Mr. President.
I have 2 simple questions for you, General. Do you have everything you need to win, and are you comfortable with the strategy? The general's tone is affirmative and direct.
Mr. President, this force is ready.
President Bush turns to Secretary Rumsfeld. Mr. Secretary? Yes, sir. For the peace of the world and the benefit and freedom of the Iraqi people, I hereby give the order to execute Operation Iraqi Freedom. Yes, Mr. President. The president turns back to the screen. May God bless the troops. On screen, each general snaps a salute before General Franks gives the final word.
Mr. President, may God bless America.
Bush would recall this moment, writing, I knew the consequences my order would bring. I had wept with widows of troops lost in Afghanistan. I had hugged children who no longer had a mom or a dad. I did not want to send Americans into combat again, but after the nightmare of 9/11, I had vowed to do what was necessary to protect the country. Letting a sworn enemy of America refuse to account for his weapons of mass destruction was a risk I could not afford to take. On May 1st, 2003, not 2 months after the initial invasion, President Bush stood aboard the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and delivered his now infamous mission accomplished speech. The U.S. had succeeded in removing Saddam Hussein from power with precision and efficiency, but an important question remained. Where were the weapons of mass destruction? On June 1st, Senator John McCain told ABC News, I still believe we will find those weapons, but there is ample testimony to the brutality and repressiveness of this regime. Some Democrats were warm to the Republican position. WMD or not, removing a despot like Saddam Hussein was a worthy cause. Still, many other Democrats criticized the lack of progress in finding WMD. Florida Senator Bob Graham chastised the Bush administration for what he called a shameful and dangerous display of secrecy to sell the decision to go to war. And as the months wore on, the fabric of public trust began to fray, and pressure against the Bush administration intensified. On July 6th, the New York Times published a widely read op-ed written by one of Bush's foreign ambassadors, Joseph C. Wilson. In it, Wilson wrote, Having encountered Mr. Hussein and his thugs in the run-up to the Persian Gulf War of 1991, I was only too aware of the dangers he posed. But are these dangers the same ones the administration told us about? We have to find out. America's foreign policy depends on the sanctity of its information. For this reason, questioning the selective use of intelligence to justify the war in Iraq is neither idle sniping nor revisionist history, as Mr. Bush has suggested. Charles Lewis, the executive director of the Center for Public Integrity, saw another cause for concern aside from the lack of WMD. Lewis hinted at a potential connection between the invasion of Iraq and the private interests of President Bush's second-in-command, Vice President Dick Cheney. Cheney was the former CEO of Halliburton, an oil and gas services company, and the recipient of a lucrative government contract to rebuild Iraq's oil refineries. In an interview with CBS, Lewis teased this connection. Why would a defense secretary with no business experience ever in his life, not for a day, why would he become the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar oil services company? Well, it could be related to government contracts. Cheney claimed to have cut all ties to Halliburton prior to becoming vice president. And government officials claimed that Halliburton's contract had nothing to do with the vice president's previous involvement with Halliburton. But regardless of what was or wasn't connected to the real reasons of the Iraq invasion, it was clear that the honeymoon period following Bush's victory speech on the USS Abraham Lincoln was over. On October 2, 2003, David Kay, the chief weapons inspector in Iraq, testified to Congress that his team failed to find any evidence that Saddam Hussein ever had possession of weapons of mass destruction. President Bush responded immediately, telling the press on October 3rd, "This interim progress report is not final. Extensive work remains to be done on Saddam's biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons programs." In the aftermath of Kay's report, Democrats saw an opportunity to take President Bush to task. To lead the charge into an election year, many Democrats would look to a popular war hero with a solid reputation and big political ambitions, Massachusetts Senator John Kerry. As a young man fresh out of college, John Kerry had volunteered to serve in the Vietnam War, where he won the Bronze and Silver Star for heroism in combat, along with 3 Purple Hearts. But his service in the war had led him to bitterly oppose a prolonged occupation. In 1970, Kerry had joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a coalition of veterans turned activists who rose to national prominence and helped lead the anti-war movements of the early 70s. Then, as a senator, Kerry had voted against military action in Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. But after 9/11, Kerry voted for the resolution authorizing the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, a decision he would later call the single biggest mistake I made in 28 years as a senator. After the removal of Saddam Hussein, Kerry, like many Democrats, remained relatively quiet about the lingering issue of the missing WMD. Kerry had announced his candidacy for president on December 2, 2002, and by October of 2003, he was already a party favorite for the nomination. Then, after David Kaye's testimony in early October, Kerry drew a line in the sand. He voted against the president's request for an additional $87 billion for military spending. Over the course of the next few months, Democrats would intensify their attacks on the Bush administration, and Kerry would be at the helm. On November 15th, during a speech at the Veterans Memorial Arena in Des Moines, Iowa, Kerry took direct aim at the president, saying, "I know something about aircraft carriers for real, and I have 3 words for George W. Bush that I know he understands. Bring it on." And on December 3rd, 2003, Kerry delivered a well-received speech in front of the Council of Foreign Affairs, where he took aim at Bush, saying, "I have said before, and I repeat today, that the Bush administration should swallow its pride and reverse course, but the evidence is strong that it lacks the wisdom or the will to do so." But even as Kerry was gaining momentum in the public eye, his campaign was financially running on fumes. So much so that Kerry was considering mortgaging his family home in Boston to cover the expenses of the campaign. And a lack of funds wasn't Kerry's only mountain to climb. There was also the grassroots campaign of the former governor of Vermont, Howard Dean. Howard Dean had spent the bulk of 2003 traveling the country and garnering support. Dean built a true grassroots campaign, meaning the money he raised came primarily from individual donors who'd contribute $10 to $20 at a time. Unlike many of his Democratic colleagues, Dean had opposed the Iraq War from the beginning, which helped him with many voters who were dissatisfied with the war and troubled by the lack of WMD. But at the core of his campaign was an extremely powerful and emerging political weapon, the Internet. At the time, the Internet was still taking shape, and not every political campaign took advantage of the tool. But early on, Howard Dean's team set up a website. It was easy to use, and it helped voters stay up to date with a campaign. More importantly, the website made it easy for anybody to chip in financially. Taking advantage of the Internet allowed Dean to fundraise on a massive scale and amplify his message. And although he relied heavily on the support of individual citizens, by early December 2003, Dean had also won over a few of the country's largest labor unions. And on December 9th, his campaign would be given a massive boost when former Vice President Al Gore, the man who ran against Bush in 2000, officially endorsed Dean's campaign. Howard Dean was on the rise. John Kerry was fading into the background. So heading into the new year, Kerry faced a difficult decision: accept defeat and bow out gracefully, or double down, mortgage his home, and keep on fighting. On Christmas Eve, Kerry made his decision public. He would stay in the race. But Kerry knew his campaign had just enough money to make it through the first primary, the Iowa caucus. After that, the campaign would be broke. But if Kerry could pull out a win in the Hawkeye state, he just might have a fighting chance. In the first 2 weeks of January, Kerry narrowed the focus of his campaign. His speeches at rallies and town hall meetings in Iowa covered a variety of topics, from healthcare to the economy to education. But the crux of his message revolved around one central theme: the Iraq War. To gain the confidence of Iowan voters, Kerry would turn to a group with whom he shared an unbreakable bond: American veterans. With the Iraq War still lingering and American troops still on the ground overseas, Kerry began taking aim at President Bush.
Here's the problem. George Bush, as you recall, remember on Veterans Day, he went to Arlington National Cemetery and laid a wreath? The very next morning, I picked up the paper and read that 1.2 million veterans were being pushed off the VA by the increase in enrollment fees and costs.
In Iowa, Kerry capitalized on growing anti-war sentiment. Max Cleland, a former senator from Georgia and a wheelchair-bound triple amputee veteran of Vietnam, began campaigning across the state for Kerry. Peter Lawson, lead singer of the folk group Peter, Paul and Mary, and a leading figure in the Vietnam protests, joined Kerry's cavalcade and provided the opening act for many of Kerry's rallies. Everywhere Kerry went in Iowa, he brought scores of veterans with him. On Wednesday, January 14, 2004, with just 5 days to go until the Iowa caucus, an article in the New York Times reported that 3,000 Iowa veterans had signed up as supporters and thousands more had informally agreed to caucus for Mr. Kerry. But though the Kerry campaign was fighting back with his veteran army, the polls showed Howard Dean with a comfortable lead. The clock was ticking. In order to surpass Dean, the Kerry campaign would need a miracle. On January 17th, 2 days before the Iowa caucus, fate would intervene in the form of an unexpected voicemail. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's Saturday, January 17th in Dubuque, Iowa. Senator Kerry sits alone on his double-decker campaign bus, the Real Deal Express. Kerry has just finished up at a massive rally. He's asked for a few moments alone to get some much-needed shut-eye. But just as he starts to drift off to sleep, a staffer suddenly shakes him awake. "Mr. Kerry, sir? What is it?" As Kerry rubs his eyes, the staffer kneels down in the middle of the aisle. Kerry is irritated, but he does his best to remain polite. "Yes, is everything all right? Something has come up and we're not sure what to make of it, but we think it might be really good news." Kerry is a man in search of good news. So he perks up in his chair. "Well, I like the sound of that. What's going on?" "What do you remember about the man you pulled from the Bay Hap River?" "I'm sorry, what?" "The Bay Hap River, sir, in Vietnam. What do you remember about the man you rescued?" "You mean Rasman?" The staffer smiles immediately. "Yes, sir, Rasman. What do you remember about him?" "Well, I remember he was tall, very tall, rail thin. He was a Green Beret, had reddish hair." The staffer smiles again, and he turns to a group of other staffers waiting at the front of the bus and shoots them a thumbs up. Kerry is confused. "What's going on here? I haven't seen Rasman since... That was 35 years ago. What is this about?" "Well, sir, he's on his way to Iowa right now. He wants to endorse you." "Endorse me?" "Yes, sir. Get ready. We're about to have a reunion." On the morning of January 17th, the Kerry campaign received a voicemail from a man named Jim Rasman. In the voicemail, Rasman recalled the day in 1969 when Kerry saved his life in Vietnam. During an ambush, Rasman fell out of a small boat that was taking him and his men to safety, a boat driven by John Kerry. After seeing Rasman fall overboard, Kerry turned the boat around in the middle of an intense firefight and pulled him back on board. After hearing Rasman's story, Kerry's team arranged to fly Rasman to Iowa and set up a press conference for their reunion. In 1969, Kerry saved Rasman. 35 years later, with Kerry's political future hanging in the balance, Jim Rasman was ready to return the favor. Just days before the Iowa caucus, Kerry's team arranged a press conference at a small convention center in Des Moines, Iowa. When Kerry walked in the door, members of the media watched as Rasmussen immediately stood up. With tears welling in his eyes, he embraced John Kerry. At the podium of the press conference, Rasmussen thanked Kerry, saying, "I owe this man my life. He's going to get my vote." Rasmussen's presence in Iowa was arguably the deciding factor in the caucus. On Monday, January 19th, John Kerry won Iowa, earning 38% of the vote and a new nickname, Comeback Kerry. Howard Dean, seemingly unbeatable coming into Iowa, finished third. And at the end of the night, when Dean tried to rally his supporters, he sealed his fate with an infamous yip.
You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Ah!
The Dean scream, as it came to be known, was the end of Howard Dean's campaign. As a reporter for the U.S. News and World Report would later write, the screen lives on as a case study of how a brief gaffe, given saturation coverage by the media, can cause deep damage to a politician's image. So with Dean no longer a political threat, Kerry's stiffest competition was a North Carolina senator who finished second in Iowa, John Edwards. Still, Kerry won Iowa by a sizable margin, and he was confident that he could outlast the young senator. During his Iowa victory speech, John Kerry joked to a crowd of supporters, "When I came back from Vietnam in 1969, I don't know if John Edwards was out of diapers." Then, to end his speech, Kerry took aim at someone else.
Let's go out there and win this nomination, win the presidency, send George Bush back to Texas, and we will hold up a sign that says mission accomplished. Thank you very, very much.
Democrats did stand with Kerry. Super Tuesday was held on March 2, 2004, and Kerry officially earned enough delegate votes to secure the Democratic nomination. But incumbent President George W. Bush was a formidable opponent. Aided by a stalwart team and a campaign purse of over $85 million, the man they called W had no intention of returning to Texas. By April of 2004, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the Iraq War as it had come to be known, was far from over. The conflict had already taken the lives of 737 American soldiers. The power vacuum left in Saddam Hussein's wake gave rise to terrorist splinter cells vying for power. Control over the region was slipping from the military's grasp, and the pressure on President Bush was mounting. On April 13, 2004, in a radio address to the nation, President Bush addressed his critics saying, "Some have suggested that we should respond to the recent attacks by delaying Iraqi sovereignty. They want America and our coalition to falter in our commitments before a watching world. In these ambitions, the enemies of freedom will fail." In an interview with the New York Times 4 days later on April 17th, John Kerry responded to the address stating, "The president may not want to admit mistakes, but his choices in Iraq have so far produced a tragedy of errors. The failure of the administration to internationalize the conflict has lost us time, momentum, and credibility, and made America less safe." Throughout the month of April, Kerry continued his attacks on President Bush's foreign policy decisions while underscoring his own military record to show his fitness as a wartime candidate. But Kerry had plenty of critics. Some questioned Kerry's strength as a wartime leader. A poll conducted by NBC in early May asked voters a simple question: which candidate would be better at keeping America safe? The response was a resounding win for Bush. And in the same poll, voters were asked which candidate could better handle the situation in Iraq. Again, the poll showed that voters clearly favored Bush. This uncertainty about Kerry's leadership skills gave President Bush an opportunity to attack Kerry's shaky voting record following the 9/11 attacks. Kerry had voted in favor of authorizing military action against Iraq in October of 2002. But the following year, in October of 2003, Kerry voted against additional military spending. As a result, in the spring of 2004, Bush's campaign began calling Kerry a flip-flopper. Around the same time, Kerry's record of service as a swift boat captain in Vietnam came under fire. On May 4, 2004, Admiral Roy Hoffman, himself a former swift boat captain, held a televised press conference with other swift boat veterans. The Swift Boat Veterans for Truth disputed certain aspects of Kerry's military record. At the conference, Admiral Hoffman cited a doctor's report from 1968, which painted a dubious picture of the events surrounding Kerry's first Purple Heart medal. In the report, the doctor wrote, some of his crew confided that they did not receive any fire from shore, but that Kerry had fired a mortar round at close range to some rocks on shore. Crewmen thought the injury was caused by a fragment ricocheting from that mortar round when it struck the rocks. That seemed to fit the injury, which I treated. Admiral Hoffman also called Kerry's loyalty to veterans into question and labeled Kerry a traitor for his anti-war activism when he returned from the war. Kerry's team didn't waste time in hitting back. According to an article in the New York Times, Kerry aides immediately dismissed the new group as an arm of President Bush's re-election campaign and accused it of engaging in Nixonian dirty tricks. But the group denied any association with the Bush campaign. John O'Neill, the founder of Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, told the press that he had paid for the press conference personally. But as the New York Times article noted, the group's publicist, Mary Spaeth, worked in the Reagan White House and has given money to Mr. Bush's campaigns. Still, Senator Kerry seemed reluctant to directly attack the members of the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. Instead, Kerry turned his attention to the men in President Bush's political machine. For Kerry, all fingers pointed toward one man, the chief architect of Bush's re-election campaign, Karl Rove. As the Los Angeles Times reported, Senator John F. Kerry, responding to Republican adversaries who call him weak on defense, lashed out Friday at Vice President Dick Cheney and White House political advisor Karl Rove, accusing them of avoiding military service. At a rally at the University of Pittsburgh, Kerry told a crowd of 10,000, "I'm tired of these Republicans who spend so much time denigrating Democrats and other people's commitment to the defense of our nation." But the true origin of the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth was still a mystery. Who organized the group? Who really funded them? On May 5th, Kerry's team set up a press conference for Vietnam veterans who supported Kerry. Wade Sanders, who fought alongside Kerry, told the crowd, "I think the Swift Boaters will sicken and revulse the vast majority of the American people, and will backfire on this president and this vice president." But perhaps the real truth behind the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth organization was that it was a symptom of an emerging issue in American politics. The 2004 election was the first to be conducted under a new system of rules for campaign financing. This system was established by a piece of legislation adopted in 2002, the McCain-Feingold Act. The goal of the bill was to reduce the role of soft money in political campaigns. According to a Washington Post article written in the late 90s, soft money is the unlimited and largely unregulated contributions frequently running to six figures from wealthy individuals, corporations, and labor unions. The McCain-Feingold bill was arguably well-intentioned, but by restricting soft money donations, the bill encouraged outside groups to step in and fill in the gap. As the Post article explained, under the law, soft money cannot be given to a candidate's campaign, but can go for party building or an issue campaign. In the election of 2004, both the Republican and Democratic parties would take advantage of the bill's limitations. By one estimate, from the 2000 to 2004 election, campaign spending increased by nearly a third to $3.9 billion. The independent groups doing the bulk of the spending became known as 527s, named for the section of the tax code which created them. Arguably, the most infamous 527 was the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. But by July of 2004, the Swift Boaters, as they were sometimes called, had largely fallen out of the national spotlight, and John Kerry's coronation at the Democratic National Convention went smoothly. For his running mate, Kerry chose John Edwards, the North Carolina senator who had finished second in the Iowa caucus. Kerry would cap off the convention with a rabble-rousing speech. Surrounded by many of the men who fought alongside him in Vietnam, Kerry began by saluting the camera.
"I'm John Kerry, and I'm reporting for duty."
Polls conducted in the early days of August showed Kerry with a slight lead over George W. Bush. Bush's team took notice. In late July, Vice President Dick Cheney made an impromptu visit to a national convention for the disabled American veterans in Reno, Nevada. In a speech, Cheney reassured them that America's veterans are a priority for President Bush. And at each of the president's campaign stops around the country, Bush's team made sure that signs reading "Veterans for Bush" made their way into the crowd. But as the race moved into August, the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, aided by a bevy of private fundraisers, came back stronger than before. As the New York Times reported in August of 2004, the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth advanced its cause in a book, in a television advertisement, and on cable news and talk radio shows, all in an attempt to discredit Mr. Kerry's war record, a pillar of his campaign. Senator Kerry had been reluctant to personally call out the Swift boaters for fear of attacking fellow veterans. But with the presidency on the line and the election just 3 months away, Kerry would take the Swift boaters to task and meet fire with fire. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War through the war itself and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. By August of 2004, the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth had grown in size to over 250 members. Throughout the month of August, they unleashed a flurry of advertisements attacking Kerry's military credentials.
If you have any question about what John Kerry's made of, just spend 3 minutes with the men who served with him 30 years.
I served with John Kerry.
I served with John Kerry.
John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
He is lying about his record.
I know John Kerry is lying about his first Purple Heart because I treated him for that injury.
John Kerry lied to get his Bronze Star. I know. I was there. I saw what happened.
His account of what happened and what actually happened are the difference between night and day.
John Kerry has not been honest, and he lacks the capacity to lead.
When the chips were down, you could not count on John Kerry.
John Kerry is no war hero.
He betrayed all his shipmates. He lied before the Senate.
John Kerry betrayed the men and women he served with in Vietnam.
He dishonored his country. He most certainly did.
I served with John Kerry. John Kerry cannot be trusted.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
In response, John Kerry fought back. As the New York Times reported in August, after weeks of taking fire over veterans' accusations that he had lied about his Vietnam service record, Senator John Kerry shot back yesterday, calling those statements categorically false and branding the people behind them tools of the Bush campaign. Even some Republicans came to Kerry's defense, with John McCain telling the Associated Press, "I think the Bush campaign should specifically condemn the Swift boat ad." Bush's team denied allegations that they were behind the advertisements. The president's communication director, Nicole Devenish, told the press, "We have never and will never question John Kerry's service." And on August 26th, Bush told the New York Times that he did not believe John Kerry lied about his service record, adding, "I understand how Senator Kerry feels. I've been attacked by 527s too." Because around the same time of the Swift boat advertisements, a pro-Kerry 527 released an ad discrediting Bush's military service.
I heard George Bush get up and say, "I served in the 187th Air National Guard in Montgomery, Alabama." Like, really? That was my unit. And I don't remember seeing you there. So I called friends, did you know that George served in our unit? No, I never saw him there. It would be impossible to be unseen in a unit of that size.
Texans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
One NBC News article estimated that the president had been targeted by an estimated $60 million in commercials by outside groups since the campaign began. The ads from the 527s were brutal and unrelenting, and both Bush and Kerry were caught in the crossfire. But by the end of the month, it appeared Kerry was bearing the brunt of the blow. Having led the polls heading into August, Kerry was now trailing, and it seemed Bush was steaming towards victory. That is, until September 30th at the first presidential debate in Florida. There, Kerry would try to outshine and outperform the president and deal George W. Bush's re-election prospects a mortal blow. The first presidential debate was held on September 30th at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. The main topics of the evening were Iraq and the war on terror.
Just because the president says it can't be done, that you'd lose China, doesn't mean it can't be done. I mean, this is the president who said there were weapons of mass destruction, said mission accomplished, said we could fight the war on the cheap, none of which were true.
30 seconds, Mr. President.
You know my opinion on North Korea. I can't say any more plainly.
What do you use the word truth again?
Pardon me?
You're talking about the truth of the matter. Use the word truth again. Did that raise any hackles with you?
Oh, I'm a pretty calm guy. I mean,
okay. All right.
I don't take it personally.
Yeah.
But you know, look, we looked at the same intelligence and came to the same conclusion that Saddam Hussein was a grave threat. And I don't hold it against him that he said grave threat. I'm not going to go around the country saying he didn't tell the truth when he looked at the same intelligence I did.
It was a threat. That's not the issue. The issue is what you do about it. The president said he was going to build a true coalition, exhaust the remedies of the UN, and go to war as a last resort. Those words really have to mean something. And unfortunately, he didn't go to war as a last resort. Now we have this incredible mess in Iraq. $200 billion. It's not what the American people thought they were getting when they voted.
A reporter for the New York Times, James Bennett, summed up the night writing, Mr. Bush was all topic sentence in the debate last night. It was often the same sentence. Mr. Kerry was all paragraph and dependent clause, using stacked thoughts and elaborate detail. On October 13th, 2004, Gallup polls published in the Wall Street Journal showed Bush and Kerry tied, with each candidate predicted to win 45% of the popular vote. The two men were neck and neck, and many feared a repeat of the too-close-to-call 2000 election, in which the results of the one state of Florida caused a bitter 6-week legal battle and ended in controversy. In an op-ed written for The Guardian, former President Jimmy Carter warned, reforms recommended after the recount in Florida have still not been implemented because of inadequate funding or political disputes. The disturbing fact is that a repetition of the problems of 2000 now seems likely. But in the 2004 contest, as is often the case in American elections, October would bring with it a big surprise. It wouldn't be a sex scandal or a damaging leak. Instead, it would be a video cassette that would stoke fears, raise the stakes, and give one candidate a boost in the final days of the election. It's early in the morning of Friday, October 29th, at the American Embassy in Qatar. It's still dark outside. A senior State Department official sits in a small, quiet office, typing away, getting a head start on the day. Come in. Sorry to bother you, sir. This just arrived. The aide plops a small cardboard package on the desk in front of the state official. The man looks at it with a curious expression. Well, what is it? I'm not sure, sir. I thought you should open it. The aide hands the official a pair of scissors, and he slices open the top of the box. Encased in a protective styrofoam mold is a video cassette. The official takes the tape out of the box and inspects it. Well, it's got no markings on it. What do you think it is? Well, there's only one way to find out. The official walks over to the television set in his office and pops the tape into the VCR. The two men stand in front of the television, watching the blank screen as the cassette begins to spin. Suddenly, a man appears on screen. He wears a robe and a white turban, and he dons a long black beard. He stares into the camera with dark and sullen eyes. After a few seconds of silence, he begins reading a piece of paper in Arabic. The two men look at each other immediately. Is that who I think it is? Yes, that's him. Who else has a copy of this tape? I need to know. I don't know, sir. It was sent to us by the local news. Damn it, we might be too late. Quickly, put me through to the Pentagon. The assistant reaches for the phone, dials the number, and hands over the receiver. When the official superior comes on the other end of the line, the official delivers the striking news. "Sir, we've just received a videotape that needs your immediate attention. It's bin Laden. He's back." The video of Osama bin Laden rocked the nation. Bin Laden had been radio silent for the better part of 2 years. Many were beginning to suspect he'd been captured or killed. But the tape was a chilling reminder. Bin Laden was still alive. The wounds of 9/11 had not yet healed. And for the American people, the stakes of the 2004 election were just raised. After the video's release, both Kerry and Bush condemned bin Laden. But for the incumbent president, the video arguably created a political opportunity. As reporter Adam Nagorny wrote in the New York Times, the videotape could well reinforce what has been the defining rationale of Mr. Bush's re-election candidacy since the morning that planes slammed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, that the nation is at war and that this Republican president can best protect it. In the days after the tape's release, Bush jumped ahead in the polls. Heading into the final days of the race, it seemed the president would cruise to victory. But election night would bring yet another surprise. Pundits had identified Pennsylvania, Florida, and Ohio as the key swing states in 2004. Bush carried Florida, and then Kerry won Pennsylvania. But when NBC News predicted that Ohio would go into the Bush column, Senator Kerry's campaign refused to accept the results.
The outstanding issue in the Kerry campaign is the state of Ohio. The Kerry campaign continues to believe that NBC was premature in its judgment that President George W. Bush has won the state of Ohio, and it's very significant, 20 electoral votes, putting him within one vote of the 270 that he needs. They're going to spend the night deciding what they're going to do tomorrow morning. They believe that there are provisional ballots that could make the difference in Ohio for the Kerry campaign.
Voters are allowed to cast provisional ballots if they arrive at their polling place and find their names not on the rolls. With 99% of the votes counted, Bush's lead in Ohio was roughly 140,000 votes. But according to some reports, there were as many as 200,000 provisional ballots that needed to be counted, and Kerry's team was determined to hold out until they were. As the nation went to sleep, the election hung in the balance.
They're going to see what happens in the state of Ohio. Now, it's important to know that they've not yet dispatched legal teams or any political operatives out there on an extraordinary mission. So far as we know, they're going to make a decision in the morning.
In his autobiography, Every Day is Extra, Kerry described the moment as feeling like a bad dream. All the energy, all the action had shifted to a near slow-motion hazy heaviness, and I had a new appreciation for what Al Gore must have gone through in 2000. But the next morning, a harsh reality was setting in for the Kerry camp. As NBC News would later report, because a high percentage of provisional ballots are typically disqualified for various reasons, the chances that Kerry could overtake Bush were slim. After conferring with family, friends, and advisors in the comfort of his home, Kerry decided that given the unlikelihood of victory, a protracted legal battle would not be in the best interests of the country. Later that day, John Kerry officially ended his campaign. After calling President Bush to offer his congratulations, Kerry headed to Faneuil Hall in downtown Boston to deliver his concession speech.
In America, it is vital that every vote count and that every vote be counted. But the outcome should be decided by voters, not a protracted legal process.
George W. Bush won with 286 electoral votes to John Kerry's 251. Unlike the 2000 contest, when Bush won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, Bush beat Kerry by nearly 3 million votes. For many pundits, there was a simple explanation for the surge in Bush's numbers: political consultant Karl Rove. In the early stages of Bush's re-election campaign, Rove identified a new voting trend. The number of swing voters, or independent persuadable voters, was getting smaller. But the number of base voters, people who tended to vote along party lines, was on the rise. Rove's campaign strategy, known as base mobilization, centered around evangelical Christians. Dana Milbank of the Washington Post spoke to the importance of this voting bloc. Evangelicals didn't just come on board for Bush. They were campaigning. They were at the events. They were the poll volunteers. They were making the phone banks, the phone calls. That's how you win elections. Still, many voters viewed the war on terrorism and the war in Iraq as the deciding factors. Reflecting on the 2004 election, Christopher Preble of the Cato Institute wrote, "The president successfully convinced a majority of voters that the war in Iraq was directly tied to the war on terrorism. Meanwhile, Senator Kerry's campaign failed to detail how his strategy would constitute a vast improvement. Absent a clear choice on the most crucial issue of the campaign, 51% of the voters opted to stick with the status quo." But many Americans still doubted the Bush administration's honesty about Iraq. Indeed, questions over the Bush administration's justification for going to war had dogged the president throughout the campaign. As Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas D. Kristof wrote in his opinion piece for the New York Times, "A consensus is emerging on the left that Mr. Bush is fundamentally dishonest, a liar, and a schemer." Kristof goes on to explain, "I'm against the liar label. Bob Woodward's latest book underscores that Mr. Bush actually believed that Saddam did have WMD. Mr. Bush told CIA Director Tenet several times, 'Make sure no one stretches to make our case.' But the questions about Bush's integrity were not exclusively over the lack of WMD. Throughout the campaign, President Bush had insisted there was a connection between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. When pressed by reporters in June of 2004, Bush had responded, "The reason I keep insisting that there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and al-Qaeda because there was a relationship between Iraq and al-Qaeda." According to the 9/11 Commission, an independent bipartisan commission created by Congress and signed off on by President Bush, there have been reports that contacts between Iraq and al-Qaeda also occurred after bin Laden had returned to Afghanistan, but they do not appear to have resulted in a collaborative relationship. The Iraq War would hang over Bush's presidency throughout his second term. Bush had declared mission accomplished in May of 2003, but the conflict in Iraq was far from over. It would continue for much of the next decade as an insurgency emerged to oppose the occupying forces. And in Afghanistan, the bloody conflict there would devolve into a seemingly never-ending stalemate where victory seemed impossible. The turmoil overseas would leave many voters hungry for change in Washington. In the midst of deep partisan divisions, a new leader would emerge with a mission to unify the Democratic Party and the country behind a message of hope. This is episode 55 of American Elections Wicked Game, 2004, Do or Die. On the next episode, the election of 2008. New York Senator and former First Lady Hillary Clinton enters the 2008 election as the presumptive favorite to win the Democratic nomination. But Barack Obama, a first-term senator from Illinois, creates a groundswell in the party and leaves Clinton behind. To win the White House, Obama must overcome racist attacks from both sides, conspiracy theories about his birth, and a veteran Republican senator, John McCain. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Thomas Addy. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and C.L. Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
In 1998, a Manhattan socialite disappeared from her mansion on the Upper East Side. After a brief investigation into the crime, detectives zeroed in on one woman, Sante Kimes. As the police and media looked into the story, they couldn't believe the rap sheet of the person they just picked up. Slavery, people trafficking, fraud, murder? What would drive someone to all of that? Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the true crime history podcast American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, the life and crimes of a woman so obsessed with wealth that she'd do just about anything to get it. Listen to American Criminal Sante Kimes wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.